Hey everybody, it is James Lindsay and you are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we are continuing our series which will be sprawling about the Nazi experiment. So I'll do a very quick summary of what the Nazi experiment means, and as a framing for what happened in Germany from the 1920s through to the 1945 when the Nazi regime collapsed. But also I will talk about what the Nazi experiment series means, why we're doing this, what it is, what I'm doing, and I'll try to catch you up on the other episodes, which of course you should go backwards and listen to. This is episode number 3 in the formal series, so episode number 4 kind of in the sense that I did a prequel to the whole thing a few months ago. But in this episode we're going to read Volume 2, Chapter 4 of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. And so that tells you a short summary of what I'm doing with this podcast series. I'm reading Hitler to you, and I'm doing it in an order that I think reveals what his project was. So chapter by chapter or piece by piece, with some extra materials added in here and there as we need to, I'm going to lay bare what I have called the Nazi experiment. The reason I'm calling it the Nazi experiment is because the framing that I'm adopting for this series is that Germany following World War I found itself in a variety of conditions that it deemed were intolerable. The Nazi Party launched a grand societal experiment to see if they could fix those conditions, and it failed miserably. So what I'm trying to do by framing this as an experiment is to take one step back from the, kind of squabble that has erupted about what was largely settled history about World War II, one of the most dissected periods of history in history. Trying to take a step back from that because there's a large amount of, we'll call it exploratory information, it's propaganda, coming from the radical right that's trying to revitalize the idea that Hitler maybe didn't have it all wrong. As a matter of fact, maybe even he wasn't that bad of a guy. Maybe, in fact, we've been told lies about World War II and its causes, and in particular about Hitler, the mustache man, and his motivations. So the point of this is to say, okay, let's just look at the Nazi experiment for what it actually was. What source could possibly point us to what the Nazi experiment actually intended to do, which then matched what it actually did? What if Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, had written a manifesto? Oh, he did. Why don't we read that? That's basically the idea. Why don't we just see what Hitler actually said the project was about? We don't have to, harp on the point. Of course, I'm going to end by saying never again is now, but because never again is now, and that's also another good podcast title you should go listen to, where I read from a related Nazi source. But that's not the point. The point is that while we're going to get to that point, I want to understand what it was that this Nazi experiment was. So they find themselves in these awful conditions. I'm not going to describe them again, at least intolerable to the German people, mostly following the humiliation of World War I and their defeat. Hitler had a lot of things he blamed that defeat on, and he writes about them in this book called Mein Kampf, which it means my struggle in German. And then he proposed a solution, and then the German people elected him in January of 1933. He assumed the chancellorship. The German people elected him to enact this experiment, and the result was one of the greatest catastrophes of human history. And so the point there is, okay, maybe if you find yourself in conditions that feel similar, not that way. Maybe that wasn't really a solution. Maybe it was a false solution. It's like if you did an experiment trying to fix your car to make it even less personal. And you say, well, maybe I need to tighten this thing. And you tighten this thing down. And then it won't even start because that thing needed to let airflow come through or whatever. Well, it wasn't that. Don't do that again. That's the basic idea. Only in this case, it's not just that your car didn't start, it's that you did the thing and then the engine blew up, and the whole thing caught on fire and burned down your house. It's, really quite remarkably bad. So to summarize so far in this series, the prequel that I did, which introduces the concept or the terminology of the Nazi experiment, reads Chapter 2 of Volume 1. Hitler's manifesto is in 2 chapters, one where he bitches about his experience in the world and Germany, and one where he outlines the plan for what he wants to do about it, which is what we're focusing on primarily in this series. So in the prequel, I read from Chapter 2, where he learned to blame Jews for the entire problem. The real problems of Germany really came down to the Marxists, and then he suddenly realized that the Marxists are all Jewish, and then he realized, in fact, that Marxism is Jewish, and then he realized that Germans are not Jews, and he was very happy, and Jews are not Germans, and that made him very happy, and this led him to develop what we explored in the first volume of the actual podcast series, since it's that was a prequel. The first volume of the series explores Hitler's racialist worldview. And so Hitler created a racialist worldview that was the basis for his National Socialism project. It was going to be the basis for how he organized his society and thus the Nazi experiment. I reveal that this is an idealist conception that's based in explicitly believing that different races are more or less competent to do the things that uphold a civilization. And of course, the Jews are a very bad race, according to Hitler. And therefore, he's going to institute a worldview based entirely off of racialism, which is an old-fashioned word that literally means racism. Now, the history of the word racism itself is pretty fascinating. It came up from a right-wing lunatic in France who thought he was doing a great thing by creating what amounts to a racialist worldview. But I digress. The next volume takes us backwards in the text. It takes us back to the first volume in chapter 11, which is the worst chapter in a lot of ways. It's where Hitler describes how he thinks race works. I don't read the entire chapter. It's actually very long. I skipped the long part where he explains how he thinks the Jews managed to infest a society, but he explains his racialist worldview holds up a particular master race that's invested in the production of high culture called the Aryans. The Aryans are overwhelmingly located in the German peoples, although that's a little bit complicated already by the time he's writing that in the early 1920s. He says that the cause of their loss in World War II was the racial pollution that had already weakened Germany from the inside, and that his project would actually be to set against the Jews as the worst possible race, the Aryan as the German Aryan as the true greatest race. And so the whole purpose of the Nazi experiment is, in fact, to generate racial purity through a totalitarian state so that it can dominate the world, which he's extremely clear about. And the greatest polluter of all of the races is the Jew, which he's extremely clear about. So now we turn in this episode to Volume 2 of Chapter 4 of Mein Kampf, which is titled Personality and the Conception of the Folkish State. Let me see if it's in the same... The people's state is how Ford translates it, but it's the folk state or the folkish state. So personality is at the center of this. And in fact, the general argument that we're going to find in this chapter is that Hitler has... What we've skipped, remember I did chapter 1 of volume 2, and I have not done 2 or 3, and I think they're very important, but we will come back to them. That's where Hitler lays out the way his worldview hooks to the state. Now in chapters 4 and 5, which will be this episode and the next one, he explains how his racialist worldview embodied in the people's state or the folkish state is going to actually interact or operate. And so in this, he takes this state concept that is embedded in the world concept or worldview that he holds, which is the racialist worldview we've developed so far, and talks about how the concept of racial purity and the Aryan ideal are central to that. And he lays out, although it's very poignant in chapter 2, which we'll come back to later in the series. In chapter 2, he lays out that the purpose of the state itself is to purify and maintain the purity of the race and allow for its greatest elements to rise in the kind of evolutionary or eugenic struggle that he outlines in chapter 11 of the first volume. Well, here, the idea is that to elevate the German people and promote their cultural integrity, they have to promote their racial integrity, which is the foundation of a strong nation in Hitler's view. The way he does this is by emphasizing the importance of individual personalities rather than collectives. So he's laying the groundwork for the basis for the Nazi fascist structure, which will be called the Führerprinzip, the leader principle, which is a top-down, at every level, pyramid authority hierarchy that was going to be the operation of the entire Nazi regime. And the idea was that there would be this kind of survival of the fittest amongst the Nazis and the Aryans to climb the ladder within that hierarchy. And so he criticizes democratic and parliamentary and liberal and free societies, saying that they actually are designed to dilute the capacity for strong leaders to rise and thus produce mediocrity. And so it lays the foundations for Hitler's belief, this is being essential to the Nazi experiment, in a hierarchical authoritarian state where the leader principle, the Führerprinzip, in the Völkisch principle about the people, which is centered on racial unity, are going to guide all aspects of governance, culture, and society. And so this is where we're starting to get to the essence of the Nazi experiment. The state is going to utilize personality by overriding personality in a kind of Hunger Games version of climbing the ladder through a leadership principle that's in direct opposition. It's fascist in its structure, in direct opposition to the liberal, parliamentary, democratic structures of society that he is so angry at for having, in his view, watered down the German people at the level of their blood, causing them to lose their soil, thus the blood and soil thing. And he wants to overcome that. So this is essential to the Nazi experiment. It's not just that there's going to be a racial worldview. It's not just that it's based on a master race that can lead society into its idealized or perfected state. And it's not just that it's going to be incorporated in the state itself. It is in fact going to be a principle by which leadership is developed through individual kind of hero characters whose duty is ultimately completely bound through the Führerprinzip to the authoritarian structure held out in the name of the folk or the people. So chapter 4 of volume 2 of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf is titled Personality and the Idea of the Folkish State or the People's State. The Ford translation that I'm reading from, which is the nicer of the translations that I have, and I go back and forth between them, calls it the People's State. The Folkish State would be in German. He starts off, if the race-based National Socialist state, so let's just stop before we even finish a clause, right? Here, by this point in the book, chapter 4 of the second volume, where he's laying out the plan for the Nazi Party, he already accepts the idea that the National Socialist state is race-based. So let absolutely no one ever lie to you about this. This book, Mein Kampf, was published in 1925, way before he took chancellorship in 1933, way before he started conquering territory, way before World War II officially began in 1939, way before things got really ugly in 1942, way before the collapse in 2 decades before the collapse in 1945. He was saying in the early 1920s, decades before it happened, that the National Socialist state is race-based. The Nazi experiment includes the idea of an authoritarian state structure that is based on race as the identifier of being a true member of the state or the nation. It is an ethno-nationalist fascism. Like I've said in other episodes, I'll just remind you, I think that fascism takes 3 different modes, 3 different faces, depending on how they decide to characterize what makes a nation. If you threw in Stalin's nationalism, where he writes in Marxism and the National Question, you could actually probably come up with a 4th one. But we'll leave Stalin out of the story for the moment, although he was called a National Socialist by Lenin quite derisively. The 3 forms that we saw arise in Europe in reaction to communism were Mussolini's Italian fascism, which was based on Italian elite theory and Italian political identity. Then you had Hitler's National Socialism, which was based on an ethnic conception of the true German people. So it was an ethno-nationalist definition that gave rise to an ethno-nationalist fascism. And then you had in Spain Franco arising, who you may say is only, partially fascist or less fascist than these other 2. But Franco's fascism is around the idea of a cultural identity of all Spaniards. So a cultural nationalism bound in religious identity as Catholics. So when you hear people like Joshua Abatoy, who is a director of New Founding, which is a large venture capital project that is in the woke right Christian nationalist space, that is connected to the American Reformer, that is connected to the Society for American Civic Renewal, that is connected to the Center for Baptist Leadership, directly, intentionally, all of those. When you hear Joshua Abatoy say we need a Protestant Franco in America, what he means is we need a at least semi or totally fascist dictator who redefines Americanness through a Protestant religious identity and tries to unify all of America under that identity, and one can assume persecute those elements of the United States that do not want to be bound under that Protestant identity in the same way that Franco persecuted not just his political enemies, but people who didn't want to be brought into the Spanish Catholic national identity he was foisting on the country. Okay, that's a long digression, but 3 faces of fascism: political nationalist, ethno-nationalist, cultural nationalist. And the Christian nationalist movement in the U.S. right now is heavily invested and directly and visibly invested in copying the Franco model. Hence, people like Jack Posobiec pushing Franco Friday now every week for years to try to soften people to the idea of Franco. People like Charles Haywood, who's behind the Society for American Civic Renewal, which I just mentioned, writing long, glowing pieces about the Spanish Civil War and the role Franco played in allegedly saving Spain through unifying it in a fascist religious nationalist concept. Whether it's also the much softer Yoram Hazony writing in for his national conservatism, or writing in Conservatism, A Rediscovery, or The Virtue of Nationalism, where he also sees this religious binding of a people to be the definition of the nation, and that definition of the nation he's not a fascist per se, but he has the same underlying strata, or the same underlying infrastructure, I should say, which is a cultural national identity that's supposed to be unifying, as though it won't be taken over by fascists who are in his camp and who call for a Protestant Franco. But I digress. Let's go back to Adolf Hitler. If the race-based National Socialist state achieves its main interest, the development and preservation of the human strength of the state, so its main goal of the Nazi experiment is the development and preservation of the human strength of the state, which is race-based, then it will not be enough to simply promote the racial aspects of society and then to educate society and finally prepare individuals for practical life. It will also have to make adjustments in its own organization so that it reflects the same values it promotes. So he's saying it will not be enough to make people realize that there's a racial aspect to being, say, German or Aryan, and then educate people into that racial ideology as outlined in the previous episodes, and then prepare people to live that way. No, there will be actually a need for it to make adjustments in its own organization. What's the it here? The state. The National Socialist state will have to also make adjustments in its own organization so that it reflects the same values it promotes. It would be insane, Hitler tells us, to judge a man's value by his race and then turn around and declare war on the Marxist claim that all men are created equal. Now, that claim may or may not have been taken up by Marxists, but that claim is in the American Declaration of Independence specifically, and he has it here in quotes. Okay, and we know he's familiar with America. So he's equating, in some sense, the American project with the Marxist claim of radical egalitarianism that all men are created equal. But it would be insane, he says, to judge, and I said this wrong the first time, it would be insane to judge man's value by his race and then turn around and declare war on the Marxist claim that all men are created equal if one were not determined to follow through to the logical conclusion. Once we recognize how important the purity of blood is and the importance of race in ability, then the logical conclusion is that these tests must be applied to the individual person. Okay, so he's admitted a lot there behind his worldview and project for the state that again rings uncomfortably true with the movement that we're seeing from the woke right today. The race realism question is very central. Rather than accepting that all men are created equal in the fact of their political right to rule or their intrinsic authority over other men, or more importantly, as being made in the image of God, though they have different talents to bring to the table, ideally complementary to one another over the aggregate. Rather than accepting that, we have to recognize how pure the blood is and the importance of race and ability. So we see the same problem today. We're going to now recognize the relevance of race to ability. We hear this from the race realists endlessly. They claim nobody will answer their claims, that there are fundamental differences in things like IQ and temperament and impulse control and so on that correlate strongly with race. They say the data are in and that we have to reckon with these data. They never can quite tell you, because I've asked a few times what you're supposed to do with that data. Let's say it's all true. Let's say it's not down to cultural factors or any other possible confounds. Let's say they figure out that it is all true, right? That it's race in particular that has these conclusions about statistical differences about capabilities on average. Fine, you work with individuals every single time. What do you do differently? Do you craft racist laws? Do you say, well, this race happens to be less successful on average than others, so they cannot work in a field that some of them certainly would be apt to work in? What do you do? I've never heard a real answer to the question of what do you do with that information that there might be statistical differences. I've never had a single answer. At the point of interaction, you're still dealing with an individual, and the best answer that anybody can give is to engage in some kind of minimally invasive profiling. And if so, so what? But that's not doing much of anything where the rubber hits the road. In fact, it doesn't do anything at all where the rubber meets the road. And so, once again, we have nothing to draw from this importance, as Hitler puts it, of race inability. But he says then the logical conclusion, if we accept these things, is that these tests must be applied to the individual person. Just as he says, just as I must assess nations differently based on the races that fill them, I must assess the individual person within that national community race. The fact that a nation is not simply a nation carries over to the individual within a national community. The value of a nation varies based on those races in it, and the value of a man varies based on the racial elements within him. That's Adolf Hitler, ladies and gentlemen. It is the same thing when we say a mind is not simply a mind, the same as any other. But it's not the same, right? Because he's talking about literally statistical averages based on racial characteristics across entire populations rather than literally individuals. He's making the mistake. He says, even when the elements of blood are the same within a race, their qualities are subject to 1,000 subtle variations. So it's like he gets the statistical point on the one hand and then loses it on the other. But let no one fool you about whether or not the Nazi experiment was racist. It very, very much was. Very, very intentionally from very, very early on. And realize that we do have to reckon to some degree with this crap the woke right is dredging up that's not being addressed adequately, that creates a third rail on which they can recruit. But that there is a reason why we hesitate to go into that third rail space. So we have to find ways to go into it. We have to find ways to be able to talk about these statistical differences, I suppose, without giving away to this racialist nonsense. And I think that the answer remains the answer that the American experiment has given in contrast to this all along, to say that in terms of political authority and image of God nature, that that all men are created equal, and that we must judge each individual as an individual regardless of where they come from, whether that's from money or not, whether that's from any racial background or cultural background or not. Hitler continues, though. The first thing we see from this understanding is what I would call the more crude realization. It is that we must promote the qualities found to be racially valuable within the national community and encourage them to multiply. This task may be considered crude because it can be recognized and accomplished almost mechanically. However, it is more difficult to recognize the most valuable minds that have the intellectual and idealistic qualities needed by the community, and to grant them the influence which is not merely given out of a superior's brain, but most importantly granted based on their ability to be useful to the nation. Okay, so he's not terribly elaborate here on what the task of encouraging racial qualities mechanically means. There are very strong reasons to believe, I think as we'll hear, that he means eugenics, that you can breed for them. But then he says that it's more difficult to recognize the most valuable minds, right? That have what? The intellectual and idealistic qualities needed by the community, so that you can grant those people special influence. And it's not just because they're smarter, he says. It's actually because of their duty. It's that they are their ability to be useful to the nation, to the collective, to the folk, is what actually matters. So the Ethno-Nationalist Project, he can talk all he wants about advancing spectacular individuals, but he's also saying here that the measuring stick for how you determine outstanding individuals is how useful they are to the collective. So this is like all of these projects, communism, fascism, both, this is another example of the dialectical admixture or combination of individualism and collectivism. Just like within Marx, we are each supposed to be individual species beings, right? So you're an individual person with your individual wants of hunting or fishing or doing critique, but you live within the communist structure. So only after you are a communist are you an individual. Only after you are a race Marxist and an anti-racist are you a black person. You are politically black before you are racially black, according to critical race theory. So only in terms of your utility to the political movement are you able to be an individual. Your individuality must be constrained to your utility to the broader collectivist project. Once again, though in much milder modes than this, we see this pretty frequently from the woke right. The idea, for example, that we've heard frequently from various commentators, including Carl Benjamin, who put it out very explicitly, that we don't need a free market. J.D. Vance also made this argument. I think Tucker Carlson has made this argument. We don't need a free market unless the free market is working for the people. That the economy, even though it's an emergent thing, that somehow the economy should be forced to work for the nation. And thus the people within the economy, since it's emergent, must be geared to work for the collective. That same communitarianism or communism or fascism as three different approaches to the same collectivism, where the individual variation is only permitted insofar as the collective is upheld by the individual's actions at all times. That model is intrinsic to the woke right. I'm not saying that they're the same as Hitler by any means. This is not a comparison between the vice president and Adolf Hitler. What I'm saying is that this mentality of communitarianism underlies both projects. Its correlation does not imply causation because they can both have a prior cause that is completely independent. A very famous example of this is that shoe size correlates strongly with SAT scores. It is not that having bigger feet makes you smarter. It's that sometimes children take the SAT, their feet are smaller, and they don't do that well because it's a test for adults. Adults on average do better than children. The prior cause is age and cognitive development, has nothing to do with shoes. And it has nothing to do with feet in the shoes. It has to do with whether or not somebody is fully grown or not. And in this case, communitarianism can take multiple forms. It can stay communitarian, but it can also take the forms of fascism or communism. And the commonality that precedes each of those three modes is that the individual must subordinate themselves to the collective project and is only allowed to be an individual insofar as their individual nature supports the collective directly as defined by the people in charge of it. And that's really the point of this chapter. This separation, Hitler tells us, according to ability and capacity, cannot be accomplished by unemotional, unthinking, mechanical means. It will be part of a constant struggle that is decided through the daily labors of life. So he says, the question is, we can't just breed up a bunch of gray Aryans. We have to figure out who the good ones are. And the only way we're going to figure that out, he says, is through a constant struggle. This is why I compared it to Hunger Games. So the point of this chapter is that the Nazi experiment is going to set up a state that's basically a kind of Hunger Games for people who can provide the greatest service to the nation as Hitler defines it, and that those people will be identified as superior in their capacity. So it's not whether or not they're the smartest or the most capable or the most brilliant. What they contribute has to benefit the nation as a collective, as Hitler sees it. And he's going to set up his state. The Nazi experiment's going to set up his state. This is actually an important part of the Nazi experiment discussion because it's considered to be something that might be true independently of the Nazis. Like that the Nazis got the particulars wrong, but the general principle is true. And it's kind of a disaster, right? The idea is that this is a pastiche of meritocracy. The idea with a meritocratic system in a free country is that you demonstrate your merit according to the things that you are trying to do. If you are trying to build a phone, you demonstrate your merits by building a good phone, right? And the idea, what's called the invisible hand of the market, for example, is that by every single person in a free system doing the things that they think solve problems, not just for themselves, but others in ways that they can generate surpluses so that they can sell the product that solves the problem, not just for themselves, but others, causes everything to grow and wealth to be created and spread around, right? And so you're solving the actual problems. Well, one of the problems that the woke right side and woke left, frankly, but woke right side is very concerned about is the cohesiveness of the nation. Or with the woke left, it's actually the cohesiveness of humanity. They don't care about the nation, whereas the woke right cares about the nation and doesn't care about humanity. That's one of the handful of differences that makes it left versus right. So here, what Hitler is building is not a meritocratic system. What the CCP adopted from Hitler is not a meritocratic capitalist system. The CCP runs this model. It is who can sexual favors, expletive, best for the CCP or for the Nazi party. Those people are going to rise. Okay, so the Nazi Party is still a largely centrally planned economy, at least in terms of the values and principles that people will hold in the society, and who can serve that best, they rise. Whoever can promote community cohesion and the goals of the party as the stakeholder representative of the people, those people rise. So you create a competition in sycophancy, rather than a competition in solving real-world problems for people in a way that you can produce a surplus of the thing that solves lots of people's problems, which is what a true free market capitalist system does. I don't know if that was very clear because I bleeped out the expletives. I still won't say. I'm trying to be much better about this. So Hitler goes on to describe this a little more clearly. A world concept, in other words, Weltanschauung, I can't say German things, a world concept, worldview, that rejects the idea of blind rule by democratic masses and gives the world to the best people, to the highest quality human beings, must obey the same noble principle it follows within its people and make absolutely certain that the best minds become the leadership and that those great minds are the predominant influence over the people. This worldview does not build on the idea of majority, but rather that of character. Now remember, he just said it's not about being the smartest, it's about who can provide the greatest service to the nation, which is the folkish nation or the people's state. So again, it sounds good in the second part, telling, but when you remember what he's actually talking about, it doesn't sound as good. Anyone, he says, who today assumes that a race-based National Socialist state is only differentiated from other states by emotionless qualities such as better construction of its economic system does not have the faintest idea of what a world concept or worldview really is. Okay, take this in because this is extremely important. You cannot separate out, is what Hitler's saying. You don't know what you're talking about, is what Hitler's saying. You don't have the faintest idea of what the worldview. The Nazi experiment is based on a worldview. That worldview is that there is a master race that produces all of the cultural advancement and the superior qualities, and that those people have to be identified, nourished, and risen to leadership positions as efficiently as possible. And it turns out that his worldview is the racialist worldview, that the Aryans are the superior people and all other races are a diluting factor to that racial supremacy of the Aryans, and that the Jews are a strictly parasitical race that tears apart the nation and has to be done away with. So anyone who today assumes that a race-based National Socialist state is only differentiated from other states by emotionless qualities, such as a better construction of its economic system, does not have the faintest idea what a world concept really is, he says. If they think it is created through a better balance of wealth and poverty, or a greater voice in the economic process for the broad masses, or by more equal pay through the elimination of excessive wage differences, they have been blinded by the superficial aspects. Everything I have just described, Hitler says, offers no security and does not guarantee our permanent survival. It offers even less of a claim to greatness. Hitler tells us a people who become bogged down in these outward reforms would not have the slightest chance of victory in the struggle for the nation's existence. Any movement that believes balancing the social classes and promoting equal economics through, though noble, are the sole core of its mission will not produce any great results or any true reform of existing conditions. All of its activity, Hitler says, eventually becomes wrapped in showiness and totally preoccupied with appearances without giving the people the inner preparation that they need to finally overcome this, I say with certainty. Sorry, the emphasis there got wrong. There's no comma where there should be one or a dash. Without giving the people the inner preparation that they need to finally overcome. This I say with certainty, those weaknesses we suffer from today. To understand this more easily, it is useful for us to look back at the real origins of human cultural development. Okay, so once again, what Hitler's saying is, what the Nazi project is not about a new economic system. It is about a totalizing civic religion, which is racist at its core, with the idea of generating and promoting the superior elements of a master race, somewhat through quote-unquote mechanical means and somewhat through a Hunger Games type struggle to the top, demonstrated through your loyalty to the folk as dictated by the Nazi Party as its representative. That's the stakeholder model we've talked about in the past as well. I urge you to remember that the woke right wants to build the same model. I also urge you to understand that what happened in the 1980s in the People's Republic of China was that Deng Xiaoping adopted this framework with the CCP held up as the object at the center in place of race. Not that the Chinese people don't have a racialist element to the way that they operate in their nationalism. They certainly do. But what he introduced in particular was a total worldview, one country, two systems, a total worldview in which the entire organization of the society would be to elevate the CCP and the People's Republic of China as its people. And he got this model from Hitler. So he's imported a worldview. It is a worldview underneath an entire way of viewing the world, in other words, that is being adopted here. It is not merely economic policies or reforms. And he says anybody who thinks it is going to fail. You have to have this civic religion to transform people's will, to make them want to participate in this system so that they can do things that are great and glorious. So now we turn to how the real origins of human cultural development came about, according to Adolf Hitler. He said the first step man took that visibly removed him from the animals, so we're going to get one of these mythologies, was his ability to invent. So this actually agrees with Marx, by the way. Marx says that what makes humans human is that we developed subjectivity, but not just subjectivity, but creative subjectivity. The ability to see that which is in nature and to appropriate it to ourselves. So we have a subjective vision of the way we could utilize, say, some stick, and we craft that stick through our vision in our mind into something that does not exist in nature. Marx calls that humanizing it. Hitler's calling it inventing. Say that we invent a fishing rod out of the stick or whatever it happens to be. We just need an example of something. So you have the vision for the thing in your mind and you carve the thing. Maybe it's a spear is better. It's a little simpler. And you carve the spear out of the stick, which the spear does not exist in nature, but it existed in your subjective mind. So thus the subjectivity of man is imbued into the objective object he picked up, the stick. Therefore, creating a dialectically synthesized subjective objective thing called a spear, which is a human modification of an objective thing. Hitler's making the same point. The first step man took that visibly removed him from the animals was his ability to invent. The very first invention was the discovery of tricks and strategies. So it's not actually an object that is being manipulated. Marx agreed also that this same process is done from one man to another, but that's actually what Hitler cares about. It's not actually that he figured out how to invent sticks. He figured out how to manipulate his fellows into doing his bidding. The very first invention was the discovery of tricks and strategies that were used to make the fight for life easier against other creatures and sometimes were the sole reason a struggle had a favorable outcome for man. These primitive inventions do not reveal the character of their creators because these inventions or strategies are only seen by present-day man and then only as a mass phenomenon, a collection of hunting methods and defensive actions spanning a long period. There are also certain tricks and shrewd precautions that can be observed in animals. Man is unable to determine or explore the origin of these actions, so he simply resorts to describing these actions as instinctive. In the present case, this word means nothing. Anyone who believes in a higher development of living creatures, notice he's got this progression of life there. Anyone who believes in a higher development of living creatures must admit that every impulse and every act in their battle for life must have had a beginning at some time. One individual must have done it first. There's his point, but I've got to go back a second in a moment. Then it was repeated, then others repeated it more widely until at last it became a part of the subconscious for all members of a given species and appeared as an instinct. So here he's trying to outline what an instinct is and how it developed, and in particular it comes down to man's ability to invent these tactics, which we no longer can describe what they are or how they came about. We just actually know that they're things people do, but it actually all came back to an individual. So we'll come back to that in a second. But let me come back to this hierarchy of life thing, because there's something very important here. There's a key word that I glazed over when I hesitated on it a moment ago. He says, anyone who believes in a higher development of living creatures must admit that every impulse, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The key word is development, which can be taken two ways. If you believe, so what I'm saying is that Hitler believes something most people don't, or at least most evolutionary biologists don't. Okay? So development of living creatures drives toward fitness in their environments, but Hitler believes there's a teleological purpose to create higher and higher life forms, so that the later products of evolution are less primitive and more advanced than the previous ones. Okay? And so this is extremely important, because this is the progressive understanding of evolution rather than the descriptive understanding of evolution that biologists tend to hold. I know that not everybody agrees with evolution, but you need to work with me here, because I have to explain that there's two evolutions. I've explained this a number of times in other podcasts, mostly about the United Nations, which wants to control evolution. But you must understand that there is the descriptive scientific approach to evolution, which says this happens, and that the point is that organisms outcompete one another according to fitness in their environment. And as their environment changes, that might make them more or less sophisticated in terms of their complexity over time. The point is to be more fit to the environment, which is not purposed or directed anywhere. There's not some highest end that evolution is pointing to. There are conditions at any given time that will change in the future, and organisms are disposed by the processes of life to select for those organisms that will be most successful in the environments they find themselves in, which can include adaptability to change, which humans, of course, have a fairly high degree of. This is not what Hitler believes in. Hitler believes in a higher development of living creatures through competition. This is key to understanding his racialist worldview. It's not merely that the races are different. It is, in fact, that the races are literally able to, if they want, do eugenics on themselves to selectively breed to become better or worse. So he envisions a German Übermensch, a Superman that's out there on the other side of the Aryan project. This brings him back into the schools of thought of people like the race occultist Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, and in parallel to a different one who didn't agree with him, who's Alice Bailey, who is in the Blavatsky cult. This brings him in line with the same evolutionary project that the United Nations and people like Robert Mueller are talking about. If you go back and listen to those podcasts I did about him, that there is an evolution of all living beings, and it can be It is directed to higher development one generation to the next, and therefore that the means of that development can be seized. We can, in effect, selectively breed better and better and better people. This is, and actually techniques, which he's referring to as instincts. Okay, so it's very important that you understand the racialist ideology that Adolf Hitler has is a eugenic one of intentionally improving the master race so that it can bring humanity to the highest level of human achievement. This is in kind of contrast, it's same energy, opposite direction as what the Marxists believe, which is that we're actually all communists, but we've been alienated from it. And if we could shake off our alienation, we would elevate ourselves through the Aufheben process to arrive at a higher understanding of what it means to be species beings. Rather than living in small communes, we can live in a giant global commune. Anyway, he then says that if you believe this, then you must admit that every single impulse and every act in your battle for life must have had a beginning at some time. So every new technique, that every new behavior, every new adaptation must have had a first point. And he says one individual must have done it first or characterize it, and then it was repeated. Then others repeated it more widely until at last it became a part of the subconscious of all members of a given species and appeared as an instinct. So this is the essence of what he means by the individual personality as part of the folkish state. Okay, so the collective that will eventually all take on the new instinct is the folkish state, is the Nazi state, okay? the National Socialist state, as he calls it. On the other hand, everything good that state figures out will come from some individual who figured it out. So his purpose is to create the conditions under which the superior people can A, be identified, and B, have the opportunity to bring about these new things. So this kind of weird survival of the fittest with a teleological end, like it's like arranging the world so that evolution goes a particular way on purpose, is how he envisions his racialist project in his state. Therefore, that the Nazi state will take on, if the National Socialist state will eventually take on as an instinct, that which its most successful and glorious members are able to produce. But remember, they are defined in terms of their contribution to the state or to the nation, not in terms of their actual individual capacities. This is easier to understand and easier to believe in the case of man, Hitler tells us. Man's first clever steps in the battle to control other animals must surely have been made by members of his own civilization who were particularly gifted. Even here, character was once the absolute source for good decisions and conduct that were later adopted by all mankind until they were finally taken for granted. So that's exactly what I just explained. And the same way, all common military strategy originated in one particular mind, and then it spread and came to be generally taken for granted after many years. Sometimes it may have taken hundreds of years to become widespread. Man, he tells us, supplements his first invention by a second invention. He learns to use other things. He puts objects and even living creatures to work in the struggle to preserve his own existence. Notice again that the entirety of his mentality all throughout this whole 2-volume set is the struggle to preserve your own existence. My Struggle is the title of the book, right? It's not just that he's pissed off. Struggle is the model by which people improve in Hitler's fascist model. So the state is going to produce conditions for struggles according to its whims and wishes so that people will rise up to evolutionarily fit those needs while producing, therefore, in his vision, a greater and greater master race that is even better and better at serving the Nazi nation. In other words, just like the Soviet state seeks to use the inversion of praxis to create more and more socialistic people, the Nazi state seeks to create a hierarchy of competitive conditions under which greater and greater Nazis will emerge. Man supplements his first invention by a second invention. He learns to use other things, blah, blah, blah. Okay. This is where he says the inventive nature of man, as we see it everywhere around us today, begins. We can see it from these material inventions that character is a component in such creations more and more clearly. Is it character really, though? I mean, he might mean your overall capacity or inventiveness or cleverness. But there's this funny thing, right, that laziness actually is a huge mother of invention. There's funny stories about that where lazy people don't want to do work, so they find the easiest way to do the work they possibly can, so they greatly increase efficiency in, say, manufacturing processes, for example. Anyway, Hitler says this started with the use of the stone as a weapon and continued to the domestication of animals, the artificial production of fire by man, and on to the various and admirable inventions of our day, and each of these sprang from the mind of an individual. I think that's a little bit not correct, but at any rate, some things are really obvious and lots of people figure them out independently of one another. This becomes clearer as we look at more recent inventions, or if we look at the more significant and decisive inventions of history. We know that everything we see around us in the way of material inventions was produced by the creative energy and ability of individual persons. Fundamentally, all these inventions help raise man higher and higher above the animal world, and they definitely remove him from it. They serve humanity's constant progress. Again, these people are progressives. Let me just underscore that. They serve humanity's constant progress in the effort to reach higher levels. Well, he's just talked about basically humans evolving beyond the animals, and now he wants to reach higher levels, and there's your Nazi racial experiment, which is to create conditions under which the master race will reveal itself and then will reproduce itself and advance itself to reach even higher levels of what? Of humanity. Again, I hearken you back to Madame Blavatsky's ideas and the so-called fifth root race giving way to an eventual sixth root race. Now, Blavatsky believed that would happen millions of years in the future, but every one of her devotees that went in different directions figured out different ways to believe that it was imminent, that it was happening now, and that they were going to lead the cult that figured out how to bring it into the world. Hitler had his Aryan project. Margaret Sanger came up with Planned Parenthood and mass abortion and family planning to keep the lower quality souls at smaller numbers. Hitler says even those things that made life easier, such as a simple trick for the man hunting in the jungle long ago, helps now, because it is the basis for brilliant scientific understanding, to make mankind's battle for its present existence easier and to forge the weapons for the struggles of the future. So this is the progressive idea being expressed. In its ultimate results, all human thinking and invention serve man's fight for life on this planet. This is true even if the so-called practical use of an invention or a discovery or a profound scientific insight into the nature of things may not be immediately obvious. All things together help to raise man more and more above the living creatures around him. Again, with the same spiritual elevation, hermetic transformation motif. They strengthen and consolidate his position so that he expands and becomes the dominant being on earth in every respect. And who does that? The Aryans do that. And who hinders that? The Jews hinder that. So what are you going to do? Help the Aryans, nourish the Aryans, and destroy the Jews. That's his mentality. That's the Nazi experiment being unfolded here. Don't let anybody tell you that this wasn't really horrible in every regard, okay? But I just want to quickly draw attention, it'll come up more, to how often he talks about fight and struggle and battle. So part of the Nazi experiment is also that all of life is a fight, a struggle, and a battle. So everything is oriented around fight, struggle, and battle. There's not this bid for harmony. There's not a bid for working together. There's not even a bid necessarily for prosperity. There's fighting, struggling, and battle so that the highest elevated things come out on top. Why? So that he expands and becomes the dominant being on Earth and every planet by raising himself more and more above the living creatures around him. Hitler goes on, all inventions result from the work of one person. So this is where the dialectic between individual and folkish state come into play. Intentionally or unintentionally, all these persons are great contributors to mankind. Their work later gives tools to millions, even thousands of millions of human beings to make their life struggle easier. Okay, so the dialectic is going to be that all these inventors do great things. They're great people. They bring great things into the world. They give tools to millions or billions of human beings. And the thing is that they are each individuals, but their work is actually done for the collective. Now, again, I contrast this with the model in the invisible hand of the market free state thing instead of the organized Führerprinzip state. In the free market, the idea is that these individuals are out in the world solving problems, assuming that sometimes other people might have similar problems, and trying to use their expertise to create a surplus of their problem-solving solution or creation or invention that other people might spend money on since they were not able to produce it. The idea with Hitler is a little bit different. It's National Socialist. So you're going to do this to serve the state, and the state will make sure that the people have all of the things that make their life struggle easier. It's a completely different model, so it's very easy to fall into this idea. No, Hitler just has this idea about elevating the best people to the best places. No, he doesn't have the idea of that. He has the idea of doing that through a centralized state apparatus, which is completely different. And that state apparatus is driven by a model that we could call stakeholderism, where the primary stakeholder is the Nazi Party with its worldview driving it. And if you think that you're going to end up with a stakeholder model without a worldview, whether it's the World Economic Forum, stakeholder capitalism, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, whatever the hell the UN thinks it's doing with, all of this stakeholder crap, or whether it's woke right Christian nationalist intentional communities. You're going to have a deliberate worldview that becomes the thing that everybody has to operate around, that eventually is going to be the aggregator of the solutions to problems that people come up with, that then figures out how to distribute them to the benefit of all the people who qualify to be in the community, probably through a social credit system. On the other hand, in the free market, anybody who sees a problem in the world is free to try to solve it to the best of their abilities. If they come up with a solution and that solution is something other people could also benefit from, it's not an individual thing, they are free to try to create a surplus of that below cost so that they can sell those things according to the value of people who would benefit more from solving that problem, who would wish to buy it. The essence of capitalism versus the essence of nationalist socialism. Okay, from the beginning, Hitler gives us, from the beginning of the present material civilization, we see individual persons as inventors who complement one another, and each builds on the work of the one before. The same thing is true when we look at how those inventions are used in new ways. All the processes of production are in themselves inventions and depend on individuals to think them into existence. Even purely theoretical mental work is the exclusive product of an individual person. This is impossible to measure in detail and yet indispensable for all further material inventions. The masses do not invent and the majority does not organize or think. No, it is always from the character of the individual man. A community, he said, Marx believes the same thing, but the idea is that the individual man's probably working in a factory and has to get the labor conditions off of himself so that he can think and invent and raise up. A community, he says, must be organized. Oh, it's communitarian. A community must be organized so that it assists as much as possible the work of these creative forces and makes good use of them in the community. Pause, that sounds good. Don't we want a community to organize and help us do this? Again, let me give you the difference between voluntary and involuntary, or natural and artificial. Hitler wants an artificial community. It's going to be organized deliberately, centrally controlled in order to make good use of these forces, which it also nourishes. The natural version, the free market system, is completely different. It is not the same experiment. In that, any such organization of a community, whether it's a co-op, whether it's a corporate network, whatever it is, whether it's literally a town, is voluntary. You decide you want to participate in the trade with others. You decide what you want to produce, what you want to sell, how much you want to sell it for. Everything is voluntary. Nobody is forced or held to some test, political, ethnic, or otherwise, in order to figure out how to make good use of things for the society. You are free to try to decide for yourself which one of those brings about the most capacity to solve problems. In other words, generate value and do something in the world that's of positivity. Now, of course, we look, and when you do collectivize, sometimes people are not so productive in this kind of laissez-faire, situation. So when you collectivize, say through a corporation, which is ultimately voluntary, sort of, there are complications to that. If there's only one corporation in a locality, there are some challenges to that. For example, there's something of a local natural monopoly creates a problem there. But which is what Marx actually was trying to figure out how to address and did a really bad job of it. But on the other hand, if the state basically organizes everything, there is no voluntary involved whatsoever. It can amass resources and direct them at a certain problem much more efficiently and quickly, but at the cost of everybody's freedom and at the cost of, therefore, later not being able to solve problems outside of his purview that are arising, that we might call them organic inventors would be able to find, address, and then to incentivize them, profit from in a free trading situation. So whether the invention, Hitler says, is material or mental, the most valuable part of the invention is the inventor's character. So he comes back to this again. It is the character of the person doing the work that matters most. This first and highest concern of a national organization is to place him in a position where he is most useful to the community. So you're not going to be free to pursue what you want. You're going to be placed according to the organization where you're most valuable to the people, to the community. And your character, therefore, is going to be what? Being willing to be told what to do by the state and being in alignment with it. It is the organization's purpose, he says, to put this very principle into practice. Only in this way is it released. So there he's saying this is the Nazi experiment. The purpose of the Nazi Party is to put this principle I've been describing into practice. And the principle is, in fact, the purification and elevation of the race, which he's very clear about in the preceding chapters, which we'll cover later. Only in this way, he says, is it released from the curse of mechanization so the community may take on a life of its own. It must endeavor to set leaders where they manage the masses and consequently to make sure the masses are led by the leaders. So you see the beginnings of this idea of the Führer principle. The organization, he says, remember the organization he's really talking about is the Nazi Party, must encourage these leaders to emerge from the masses and remove all barriers that could possibly interfere with their rise. In doing so, it must follow the principle that the blessings of mankind have never come from the masses, but they have come from the creative minds of individuals. In the real world, these creative minds are the founders and providers of the human race. It is in the best interest of the community to make certain these men have the dominant influence and to assist them in their efforts. Unquestionably, the interests of the community are not satisfied and served by the rule of the masses, but only by the leadership of those whom capital and nature has equipped with special talents for that purpose. The masses are not experts, the masses do not possess thinking power, and certainly the masses are not divinely gifted. Only individuals have these powers. So let's take a breath and see if we can see what he said and where he's going with this, right? So it's now the masses suck, and there are certain individuals who must arise from within the masses. The masses must then support those people. They must be plugged into the community program. It's going to benefit everybody. And you say, well, James, that's fine. He's just saying talented people need to find a way to be able to rise, and the system into which they're rising has to give them the opportunity to do that. My argument would be that a fair playing field rather than a rigged system that favors the particular political ideology and state apparatus is a superior way to allow people to rise within their communities and beyond their communities if they so desire by the mechanisms I've already described. Providing a useful product to a larger number of people, which is determined by whether or not they buy the product, not because the state said this is necessary and important, right? Now, where is this going? Where is this going? Where it's going is that the individuals that he's talking about have to become pieces in a hierarchical structure. So each individual is actually a piece, this is the dialectical synthesis part, in the grand pyramidal structure of an authoritarian society, right? So this is, he's venerating individuals, but the individuals become kind of the nodes in an authoritarian pyramid to run all of society. They are not actually individuals. Now, how do we figure out who these people are? He says these great minds are revealed mainly through the hard battle of daily life itself. Once again, many are broken and destroyed in the process, which only proves that they are not destined for the ultimate positions of responsibility. At last, only the chosen few remain. So here's your Hunger Games. The process of selection still goes on today in the areas of education, theory, creative arts, and economics. However, in the area of economics particularly, it is already subject to severe handicaps. The same idea rules the civil service, state administration, and is also seen in the power of the military defense forces of the nation. In all these areas, the idea of character, its authority over those of lower rank, and its responsibility to those of higher rank still dominates. So he says where you see this principle actually work primarily is in rigid regimented military and civil service structures where there is a pyramidal structure of absolute responsibility to the higher rank and total authority over the lower rank. That's the model that he ends up describing as the Führer principle, which Carl Schmitt said is the correct basis for his total state, which means totalitarian project, which was the Nazi experiment. We'll come to that too. Today, Hitler says, only the area of politics has completely turned its back on this most natural principle. All of human civilization is the result of the creative activity of individual persons who direct the national community, and especially those who act as leaders. So the leader as individual becomes the most important characteristic, and that's why he keeps talking about character. But in politics, he's saying it's everywhere in life, just not in politics. We've thrown it away, and why do you think everything's gone so rotten? But in politics, he says the most important principle becomes the strength of the majority. So he's going to go off against Republican democracies. From the top, it trickles down, and it gradually begins to poison all life and ultimately dissolves it. Even the destructive effect of Jewry's activity, which we can see in other nations, he just has to stab the Jews here for no reason in the middle of this, result from its constant effort to undermine the importance of the individual person in those nations hosting their presence. The Jew seeks to replace the power of the individual by the domination of the masses. The organizing principle of Aryan humility is replaced by the destructive principle of the Jew. The Jew becomes the festering rot of nations and races, and in a larger sense, the solvent of human culture. Do you think this, first of all, this is a totally unnecessary diversion into Jews, and he's about to equate them with Marxism and just keep going off about the Jews? He got off on one of his tangents and he's having a fit. Hitler does this a lot. Okay, but notice that no matter what people try to tell you about the Nazi experiment, the Jews are the evil scapegoat to the Nazis. Their Aryan race project is being completely undermined. Their Führer principle, authoritarian structure, is completely undermined by what? By the Jews. And what does the Jew do? It's a festering rot of nations and races. And thus the solvent of human culture. He says Marxism is the pure essence of the Jews' attempts to eliminate the importance of character in every aspect of human life and replace it with the numerical power of the masses. I do agree that that's what Marxism is mostly after, but I don't know that it's the pure essence of the Jews' attempt to do anything that Jews do. That's the fundamental flaw we revealed in the prequel in this series. Its political counterpart is the parliamentary form of government whose disastrous work we can see going on from the tiny nucleus of the village all the way up to the top of the Reich. Their economic counterpart is the system of trade union movements which do not serve the true interests of the wage earner but only the destructive purposes of the international world Jew. The farther out our economic system moves away from the influence of the character principle, the more it surrenders itself to the effects of the masses. So character, by the way, is really important on the woke right. They're always talking about how all of these things they're talking about need to be implemented prudently. So the prudent, or men of character, or the virtuous, or men of character, are the ones who have to be able to organize this new stakeholder system on the right that they think is going to be necessary to implement. They do not always blame the Jew for this. Some of them don't blame the Jew for this at all, like Hitler did. But what they do blame is Marxism and its radical egalitarianism, which is, in fact, kind of misplaced blame. Yes, they are radically egalitarian, and yes, that's a poisonous doctrine, but the operation of Marxism is actually the inversion of praxis model, which means that they try to force the situation so that it brainwashes people into accepting it, which is sort of the same thing that Hitler wants to do. So the idea with Marxism is that they don't have radical egalitarianism, so when they get power, they force a reversal of the lack of egalitarianism that exists and create a biased system pointing the other direction, trying to brainwash people into thinking that this bias is making up for old injustices and so on. And They don't therefore enact radical egalitarianism at all, although they do their injustices in the name of radical egalitarianism. So at any rate, the further our economic system, Hitler tells us, moves away from the influence of the character principle, the more it surrenders itself to the effects of the masses. The national economy should be productive and provide a valuable service to the community. There's that same argument the woke right make, by the way, that I mentioned earlier, but it will gradually become involved in the inevitable decline as the power of character is replaced by the influence of the masses. So I'm not going to get into it in this episode, but this actually, Schmitt ties into this very well. Carl Schmitt would not have agreed with Hitler in the early 1920s when this was being written, but he came to agree with Hitler, although a lot of his principles align with Hitler, which is why he became a Nazi so effectively and became known as the crown jurist of the Third Reich. But Carl Schmitt lays out in his book Political Theology, which he also wrote in the early 1920s, he lays out this idea that you have this problem in law or in judicial concerns where you have the norm, which is basically rule of law. You're going to follow the normal legal procedures. And then sometimes you have this thing he calls the state of exception. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on this, so I'm not going to elaborate on it too much, which is where you end up in a situation where you no longer can use the normal laws because something outside of the normal laws has arisen. And therefore, he says that there's another model. There's this normativism, which is basically rules of laws. You follow the legal norms as they exist. And then there's this other thing called decisionism, where the individual, for him, it's the executive or the sovereign, has to execute a decision. They have to make a decision that solves the problem of being outside of the normative range. The parliamentary system is when something outside of the range arises, we do not make a decision on it unless it's an emergency, and then we grant emergency powers to executives. If it's not an emergency, we hash it out, have a debate, and try to figure out what to do about it, and then make it part of the legal normal system. So it's a different model. Schmitt is arguing for a lot more decisionism by the executive in the state of exception, which means exception to the normal rules. So, for example, what's an example of that that's resonant today? You could say that the arising of the transgender identity phenomenon is in a state of exception. We have all these prohibitions on discrimination by sex, but now you have people who are one sex claiming to be another sex, and what the hell do you do with that? And as we saw in the Bostock decision, that the Supreme Court, even the conservative judge Gorsuch, couldn't quite figure out what to do with it and couldn't quite get it right. So this would be a state of exception to the normal civil rights legal doctrine. Of course, it benefits the communists to find as many such controversial points as they can that exist in the state of exception. And so what Schmitt's answer would be is that the executive should have the power to resolve the state of exception. And what the American, which has not done particularly well, frankly, but the American solution to this has been is we have to figure out how to bring this within legal purview, whether that's through decisions, including what was written in Bostock, or in other domains, such as bringing legislation, which then gets hashed out in the courts, and so on. Now you say, well, you just made a great argument for the decisionism of the executive, except imagine the executive had been Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, who decided in a state of exception to grant full civil rights powers to transgender, rather than, say, maybe Donald Trump in his second term where he understands the issue. But imagine if it had been Donald Trump in his first term where he didn't understand the issue. So it's trusting the executive an awful lot, as opposed to trusting the process. Now, I would say that wasn't necessarily an emergency situation, except that, it did become the greatest child abuse scandal and medical scandal probably in history. But this is sort of where that debate's happening. So Hitler is falling down very clearly on the side of Carl Schmitt, which is that the leader principle, and at every level in the hierarchy, you would go up to whatever level that is, that person is going to make the decision, but that person has to be of good character. And how do you know if that person's of good character? Well, he aligns with the project and the vision and the values of the totalitarian state, and that's how he rose to his position in the authoritarian hierarchy. Do you understand how they're different? Where did I leave off? We were talking about the Jews and their syndicalism, I guess. He said, all work councils which were established by the unions try to gain influence over production instead of protecting the interests of employees, so they serve the same destructive purpose. They harm the total production system and in turn harm the individual worker. The members of the nation cannot be satisfied in the long run by fancy theoretical phrases. They will only be satisfied when they receive the goods they need to carry on their daily lives. And through this process, they create a collective conviction among the national community that results in the interests of the community being guarded by the individual and the interests of the individual being upheld by the community. So here what he did was he blamed Jews for unions, trade unions, and the trade unions, which he blamed for being Jewish, then go off and try to seize the means of production instead of actually trying to make things better for employees or people who require the goods and services. But it is sort of one of his tangents. He says, it would not matter if Marxism was able to implement its mass rule theory and happened to take over today's existing economic structure, because it would not prove anything. The reliability or myth of this principle is not determined by its ability to take over and manage a system that already exists. The only valid test is whether or not it has the creative power to build up such a culture based on its own principles. If Marxism were to take over and continue the present economic structure under its own leadership, even if it tried 1,000 times over and was successful in taking control every time, it would prove nothing. Marxism would not be able to use this principle to create a system like the one it takes over today, not one that works at any rate. Marxism has given practical proof of this. Not only has it never succeeded in creating a civilization or even an economic structure, but it has been unable to continue the operation of existing structures according to its principles. When it had the opportunity, it was forced to almost immediately make concessions and return to the ideas of the character principle. It cannot do without these principles even within its own organization. So he's actually there talking about the implementation in the Soviet Union through the 1920s, and then the eventual adoption of the new economic policy, which forced them to, well, it can't be in the 1920s because he's writing this in the early 1920s. And the story, anyway, through the 1920s, the Soviet Union runs in parallel to this. We'll just not be historically correct here because I'm not sure what he's talking about specifically about where this has been tested, writing maybe in 1924. But at any rate, by the end of the 1920s, they had to introduce in the Soviet Union a new economic principle, which actually reintroduced elements of individual profit to be able to make the system work. Mao faced the same problems in China. But what he's saying here is that it wouldn't prove anything if the Marxists took anything over, and it's because they're not, it's ultimately because, and we'll hear this in a second, it's ultimately because they're not actually implementing their world concept. But he says that doesn't matter either because it doesn't work. Which is going to distinguish, his world concept, the racialist world concept, from the Marxist world concept, which is, he said all men are created equal, but it's radical egalitarianism by force is what it really is, plus the transformation of people into socialists through the inversion of praxis. I digress. He goes on, he says, what Hitler says here, what most clearly distinguishes the new race-based worldview from the Marxist worldview is the fact that the new race-based worldview recognizes the value of race and the importance of the individual and makes these the pillars of its whole structure. These are the most important factors that carry its world concept. So in other words, what he's actually telling you here secretly is that the racial identity, the Aryan German racial identity, this mythological race that he's appealing to, is the glue that is going to hold together the nationalist project that's going to make the totalitarian system of, exalted individuals supposedly work, which is fundamentally in opposition to what the Marxists have, which is eventually that everybody's supposed to be equal. If the National Socialist movement failed to understand the fundamental significance of this essential principle of character, Hitler tells us, and instead only outwardly patched up the present state or actually considered the mass rule standpoint as its own, it would then be nothing more than another party competing with Marxism on its own principles. It would no longer have a right to call itself a worldview. If the National Socialist program sought to crowd out individuals and replace them with the masses, that would mean National Socialism itself was already eaten away by the poison of Marxism, just as the world of our privileged class political parties are today. The new race-based state, Hitler explains, can best care for the welfare of its citizens by recognizing the importance of the individual's value in anything and everything relating to the operation and leadership of the community. Maximizing production in every field assures that every individual receives the maximum possible share of that overall output. So it's still socialist, but it's going to be that you have this structure rather than a radical egalitarianism with the party on top. You have this structure within the Nazi party where there's this top-down, absolute pyramidal structure of authority where allegedly each person in the structure is there because they are good at benefiting the nation and the community. And then they're going to see that there's good production and that the maximum possible share of that output is distributed. Okay, so this is still a socialist model. It's in fact still the model, again, that the People's Republic of China adopted under Deng Xiaoping rather than capitalism. And so what it works out to be is actually it's like Hitler took Marx and he looked at what was going on in the Soviet Union, and then he implemented Lenin always wanted to solve the problem of productive forces, and Hitler's come up with a method that's supposed to solve the method of productive forces much more successfully than the Soviet model, and he got that from both of his own thought, but also adapting from Mussolini's fascism, which he was observing. For that reason, he tells us, the new race-based state must remove the current obscene political leadership, especially the highest leadership positions, from the grip of majority rule by parliament. This will assure that it will be replaced by the right of the individual, and personal responsibility will be placed there instead. So we're going to get rid of parliament, and we're going to put in decision makers, who are, of course, beholden to the authority structure of the Führer principle that defines the whole Nazi party and its state form. And he keeps just reiterating that it's race-based, right? It's not even necessary in the abstract for what he's saying, but he keeps reiterating, no, it's going to be race-based, though, don't worry. From that, Hitler says, we can draw the following conclusion. The best state constitution and form of state government are those that give the greatest importance and governing influence to the best minds of the national community. I don't think that people in general disagree with that principle. What they disagree with is how you determine who those people are and then how absolute their authority is. See, in our system in a free country, again, if somebody demonstrates their capacity to have authority, we grant that to them. Sometimes it can be legally binding, as in the military. Sometimes it's entirely voluntary, whether or not you want to listen to those people. Everything's much more legally binding in the Nazi state. In our system, people rise because of demonstrated merits that are contingent upon what the actual people around them want, the so-called invisible hand. And in the Nazi state, the existing power structure will determine incestuously what it needs and who qualifies to be part of it. Those men, Hitler says, who are most capable in the economic world cannot be appointed by someone in a high position. They must fight their own way up the ladder of success. They provide themselves with endless training from the smallest business deal all the way through to the greatest industry, and the challenge of life alone does the testing. Similarly, political brains cannot suddenly be discovered. Geniuses with extraordinary ability cannot be judged by the same rules we use for normal humanity. Now, this is I get what you're saying at first, that you have to make yourself good. You aren't just discovered out in the wild. But then he throws in this weird bit, right? Geniuses with an extraordinary ability cannot be judged by the same rules we use for normal humanity. The individual principle, so they must be elevated above the rules because of their outstanding qualities, right? So the more outstanding you are, the more different your rules get to be. So the idea of political equality and fairness in judgment is out the window. The individual principle, he says, must be anchored in the state's organization, from the smallest city council through the head of the government of the entire Reich. I will point out the thing I just mentioned about the different rules for different people. It does definitely indicate that there's going to be a lot of self-serving and corruption going on in there. He says there must be no decisions made by a majority, but only decisions made by responsible persons. So again, there's not going to be any councils or parliaments. There are just going to be individual people who make the decision at every level in the whole hierarchy of society. The word counsel must be brought back to its original meaning. Every man will have counselors to assist him, but ultimately one man makes the decision. So every man is an executive. There is no other branch of government, just more and more and more executives. The principle that made the Prussian army a marvelous instrument of the German people must someday be transferred to form the basis of the state. So it's based off of the military hierarchy, thinking that which works in the military will work for governing the state. And that principle is this, Hitler says: every leader will be invested with full authority over those below him, and he will carry full responsibility toward those above. That's literally Hitler's expression of what is called the Führer principle, or leader principle, that defined the state structure of the Nazi totalitarian system. So this part of the Nazi experiment is to point out that the Nazi experiment included a totalitarian, military-inspired Führer principle, pyramidal, fascist, totalitarian object, state structure. Even then, he says, we will not be able to do without parliaments, but their counselors will only provide counsel, and one man alone will have all the responsibility, authority, and the right to command. Parliaments are necessary to identify those minds that will gradually emerge and can later be entrusted with positions of great responsibility. So there will be councils and there will be parliaments, but they have no decision-making power. They work only as counselors to the leader, and their purpose is to play the Hunger Games. Can you imagine if we use, say, state legislatures and allowed people to just rise from the state legislature through whatever cutthroat means to please whatever leader is above it that ordains the whole thing and has decision-making authority over the whole thing, instead of them being able to pass laws and debate and vote? If we had instead that there's some kind of like Hunger Games on the floor to impress the leader so that you might get named a leader yourself. That's the system he's painting here. And that's part of how the Nazi experiment was organized. The general picture of how this will work is follows, Hitler tells us. From the village up through the government of the Reich, the new race-based state, so he's driving that in again, the new race-based state will not have a representative body that decides anything by majority vote, but only advisory bodies that assist the chosen leader. The leader divides up duties among them, and as needed, they resume absolute responsibility in certain fields, just as the leader or chairman of the particular body has the responsibility on the larger scale. That's the Führer principle once again. On principle, the new race-based state, so he mentions it again, will not tolerate the practice of asking advice or accepting advice on matters that require special knowledge. For instance, in economic matters, from people who lack that knowledge and cannot possibly understand the matter due to a lack of training and experience. So this is going to be very technocratic, except that there's a decision. So you're going to have a cadre of experts with a decision maker on top of them. From the beginning, the state must divide its representative bodies into political and occupational chambers. The cooperation between the two will be assured by a special Senate that will have authority over them. No vote will ever be taken in either of the chambers or in the Senate. They are working institutions, not voting machines. The individual member has an advisory voice, but never a decisive vote. Decisive action belongs solely to the particular chairman, I bet it's Führer in German, who's responsible for the matter being considered. The principle of directly connecting absolute authority with absolute responsibility, that's a Führer principle, will gradually cause a group of leaders to emerge. This would be quite unthinkable in our present irresponsible parliament. The nation's state constitution and political structure will then be brought into harmony with the laws of nature to which the cultural and economic fields already owe their greatness. Now we go back to the previous episode, right? We go back to Volume 1, Chapter 11, where he talks about the laws of the jungle and the laws of nature and the competitive forces that define why some nations and some races are superior to others, particularly some races are superior to others, and certainly that the Jew is the most inferior to all of them. And that principle now also, that's why that principle has to be brought into this kind of fake parliament or council or senate, so that there can be this Hunger Games type competition among people, judged by their total usefulness to the national state project, to the collective, to the folkish state. Not even to the folk, by the way, to the folkish state, which represents the folk. And so by proving their usefulness in this Hunger Games type process to the existing leadership structure, they might themselves get to become leaders in the leadership structure. And the entire society is going to be defined by that. Did I read this part? Yes. For those, he says, who may question the practicality of these principles, I would ask that you not forget the system of parliament, which uses democratic majority rule, has not always controlled mankind. On the contrary, majority rule is only found in very brief periods of history, and those have always been periods of decline for the people and nations. I guess the United States notwithstanding. But I guess technically we have a Congress, not a parliamentary system. Such a transformation, Hitler says, cannot be produced by purely theoretical measures decreed from the top down, since logically it cannot be limited to the consultation of a state and expected to propagate, but it must penetrate all other legislation and all of civil life. In other words, it must be total. Hence the total state that Carl Schmitt gave a legal basis for, which we'll be doing in a future podcast. A radical change like this can and will occur only through a movement, Hitler says, which is built up in the spirit of these ideas and bears principles of the coming state within itself. Therefore, the National Socialist movement even today should make itself completely at home with these ideas and put them into practice within its own organization. So the National Socialist Party in the early 1920s, Hitler is directing, must start implementing the Führer principle now in order to become more and more powerful and effective. That way, he says, in the future, it may not only lay down the same guidelines for the state, but may put the perfected body of its own organization at the state's disposal. So there's this explanation for why the Nazi Party is going to practice to run the ideal state structure and become the ideal state. Okay, so that's the end of Chapter 4 of Volume 2 of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And now you get a greater taste of what the Nazi experiment included. It wasn't just a racialist worldview with this crackpot Aryan versus Jew thing, and plus the inferior races. It wasn't just this racial ideology. That's just the very basis for the whole thing. Now, I've skipped the part where he talks about the development of the state, and we're going to come back to that, and I think it's very important because he says that the whole point of the state is to do the race thing. Literally, the whole point of the state is to preserve and purify and advance the race. That's literally what he believes the state exists to accomplish, because the race is where everything happens, because that's where all cultural development comes from. But then there's also this instantiation of something that they called the Führer principle, the leader principle, which creates a pyramidal, top-down, absolute authority, totalitarian power structure where excellent individuals are identified essentially through a kind of Hunger Games-like situation underneath each leader in each level of the power structure, who has absolute authority over all of them. And so they fight in order to prove their usefulness to the nation state, to the folkish state, in the name of the people, but not actually for the people. And they are going to be then chosen for their capacity to demonstrate loyalty to the project that the power structure wishes to enact. And the ones who are deemed most talented, particularly in leadership, are going to be plugged into various places. Those who are deemed most talented in terms of technical ability are going to be made into the technical counselors that advise those leaders so that they can make their decisions. And you can see how this kind of extraordinarily military bureaucratic type system is characteristic of the Nazi experiment. Now, I don't know that this particularly is why the Nazi experiment failed. And I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that it is part of the Nazi experiment. We saw a few arguments that echo the woke right. But I do want to point out, just at a last kind of remark, again, that this structure is what the CCP adopted in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, when people have mistakenly believed that it opened its markets to a limited amount of capitalism. Instead of having the Führer, explicitly, the Communist Party took over the Führer structure, and the People's State of the People's Republic of China becomes the object rather than the Völkisch state in Germany, around which the entire thing is going to operate. But their markets are controlled this way. Their corporate leaders are, in fact, quasi-political entities who are beholden to that power structure and have to make sure that the state gets what it's getting, and then the state will distribute that to the people. So that reminds you of the socialist character, the National Socialist character. But again, I remind you that the nation is defined in terms of the race, and that the true deep core of the Nazi experiment is that the only way to advance Germany out of its terrible conditions following World War I is to adopt a racialist world concept that upholds the German flatteringly as the highest culture-producing Aryan race for various reasons, which must be purified and advanced to higher and higher levels, the evolutionary argument being made here in this chapter. And of course, the inferior races must be excluded, and most inferior of all of them is the Jew, and we all know what happened with that. Even Hitler in this chapter, which had nothing to do with the issue, couldn't leave alone railing on the Jews a little bit for all the things that he can't stand about them. And we know how that ended. It ended in a Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered, in addition to millions of other people that Hitler deemed inferiors and not useful to his racial Nazi experiment project, his racialist world concept, so to speak. And so, which was to advance and purify the Aryan race. So it didn't matter actually if you're Aryan, if say that you had a physical or mental disability, you weren't really helping out advancing the race if you were disabled, right? Especially mentally challenged. So you had to just eliminate those people. The Nazis did not have a good worldview in my very widely embraced view. So this is because I was able to, again, link this to the woke right today. I just want to urge, so that I can end this the same way that I've ended all the others. I just want you to urge people to realize that some of this is happening again. It will not likely take exactly the same forms. History tends to rhyme, not to repeat. But it looks very much like history is rhyming. So a little bit more for you all about the Nazi experiment, which we all know failed catastrophically. And the reason we need to know that it failed catastrophically is so that we don't repeat it. And the reason that we don't repeat it is, and that we must care enough to be going through this right now, is because, yet again, I say, never again is now.